So I know that everyone is saying right now that they want the election to be over. This is what journalists are saying. Can't wait for it to be over. I feel like my family members are saying this. I feel like every voter we talk to, they're like, I cannot wait for this to be over. But I'm curious, what are you guys going to miss about this part of election season and this exciting lead up to Election Day?
Long pause. Long pause, I think, is the answer.
The silence is telling.
I get excited when voting starts. And so I do get up in the morning and reach down to the floor next to my bed and grab my laptop where I put it the night before and start looking at data from the states. And that's fun.
Amy, that is not a very healthy sleep practice, and I hope that changes after Election Day.
My son this morning was literally talking about how you're not supposed to look at your phone for 90 minutes before bed.
Yeah, whatever.
And I'm like, he is much more well-adjusted than I am.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, November 1st. The election is next week. Oh my gosh. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
My gosh. And I am Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by our good friend Amy Gardner, who covers voting on the democracy team for The Post.
Hey, team. Great to be here, as always.
Thanks for being here. Okay, so as you both know, this has been a very busy few days leading up to Election Day. We are not sliding calmly into this. Just to start, President Trump and Vice President Harris have been making their closing arguments to voters at the Ellipse outside the White House on Tuesday. Harris delivered basically a wrap-up speech to her supporters. I was able to go, we did an episode about it on Post Reports this week, and I was surprised by the sheer number of people who were there. I mean, the Harris campaign said that it was 75,000. I don't know if it was actually that, but it seemed like a lot. At the same time, her speech really brought up points that she'd raised before. I think if people watched the debate or have seen her other speeches, there wasn't a lot that was different here.
On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list.
So in the meantime, this has also been a pretty newsy week for Donald Trump and the messaging coming from his campaign. Of course, there were the comments from the beginning of the week about Puerto Rico, a comedian at his rally calling Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. And Aaron, you did a great job diving deep into that with our colleague Philip Bump on the Campaign Moment on Tuesday.
Yeah, I was pretty struck by how scared Republicans seem to be about this, this joke. They really backed away from it pretty quickly, and the Harris campaign has gone after it pretty hard.
Though at the same time, then President Biden had his own garbage comment after that. He used the word garbage while he was talking about Trump support, and Harris tried to distance herself from that comment. Aaron, I know that you did a deep dive into this and whether or not an apostrophe might make a difference here in terms of whether Biden was actually calling Trump supporters garbage.
So President Biden was talking about the joke that was made at a Trump rally over the weekend about the floating island of garbage, and he turned that on somebody, depending on how you interpret it. He said, quote, "The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable and it's un-American." The question is whether he was saying supporters, plural, basically tarring large numbers of Trump supporters as being garbage, or whether he meant to refer to this singular Trump supporter, Tony Hinchcliffe, the comedian who said the floating island of garbage comment.
Oh, so in that case, it would be supporter apostrophe S.
Supporter apostrophe S, which makes sense because he goes on to mention his demonization of Latinos is unconscionable. Is his referring to Tony Hinchcliffe? It's a matter of interpretation, and both interpretations are very valid.
Realizing something about the importance of apostrophes totally changes the meaning.
Stay in school, kids.
So then there were comments made by Trump on Thursday night in an event with Tucker Carlson in Arizona. And he painted a hypothetical in which former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney would face gunfire. He was talking about him believing that she's too much of a war hawk, too interested in sending young people to die in other countries. And then he said this statement.
She's a radical war hawk Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
So what did you guys make of this comment from Trump?
I thought it was classic Trump, where you could interpret it in 2 ways, and that's kind of a thing that he even brags about. Isn't that what he calls the weave? Mm-hmm. Where, you know, there's an explanation that's more defensible. In this case, he's literally saying that she doesn't know what it's like to actually be in war, and he's describing what it might look like if she were actually in war. But, you know, there's the second interpretation, which is that it sounds threatening. She should have a bunch of barrels pointing at her. It makes it sound like he's describing, you know, her being in front of a firing squad or something. And, you know, immediately after the outrage, there was counter-outrage from Trump world, like, give me a break. This is what he meant, obviously. And that's kind of the cycle. That's the pattern, right?
Yeah, I think some people are going too far with this and saying that he was like advocating for her to be executed. He certainly made similar comments before. Amy's right. This is a pretty transparent attempt to give people something that they can chew over and analyze in certain ways. But I think it's important to note the context here, which is that for the last 2 weeks, Republicans have been denying that Donald Trump is talking about turning violence against his political opponents. And here is Donald Trump imagining a scenario in which his political opponent is in a violent scene. So I think it's obviously a provocation. It's obviously problematic. And it's something that is going to be a significant issue in the coming days.
And creates a real fear of, you know, what happens if Trump supporters interpret this and this sort of second meaning of a call for violence against her and what that could mean going forward. So that's all to say that this has been a week where we've been asking, like, which of these things is going to sway the election? Will any of these comments, any of these news moments, any of these messages that the campaigns are putting out, are they going to land with voters? And now we're finally at the point where we are about to find out. We're about to see, like, do voters care about this and what is going to happen?
Yeah, and so today we're going to dig into the latest polling in the 2024 election, as well as what the early vote looks like, which is Amy's specialty, as we head into the final week of the campaign. We'll also talk about lots of other stuff. So, Amy, last week, I think it was, you and I talked about the latest with the early vote. It's now Friday morning, a few days before Election Day. And I wanted to know, as you've been reviewing the numbers, have your thoughts on where things stand changed? What are the things that you're noticing right now?
Well, my thoughts on what we can glean from the early vote in terms of who wins haven't changed. We don't know. And anybody who tells you otherwise isn't right. That's my declarative statement of the day. However, 66 million Americans have cast ballots already, which is amazing. That's a figure from Michael McDonald at the University of Florida, who tracks early voting and is really great. And what I am seeing is a remarkable and potentially historic and potentially permanent shift. Early voting is really popular this year, more popular than it's been ever. And I think it makes a lot of sense. We're a culture and an economy that's based on convenience, right? We order food from DoorDash when we are hungry, and, we watch our shows on demand on our streaming platforms, and we should vote when we want to vote and when we can vote. And so we're seeing that really, really powerfully this year. And one of the reasons we're seeing it, of course, is because Donald Trump effectively gave his supporters permission to vote early, which he had not done previously. He has trashed early voting, maybe not as much as he trashes mail voting, which he still does. But he basically and his allies have really, really gone hard in on the message that please vote early, because their prior messaging was strategically damaging to him. Leaving everything up to the chance of Election Day is a strategic error. It's an unforced error. It rains, it's cold, I'm sick, I forgot that I have to take my kid to swim practice. All those things can intervene, and things are left to chance in terms of turnout on Election Day, whereas with 14 or 30 or whatever number of days of early voting, depending on the state you live in, creates additional opportunities and less to chance.
Well, so is that why you believe that you can't actually make conclusions about like who is quote unquote winning right now from seeing the early voting numbers? Because in the past, that was considered a good sign for Democrats because Democrats are the ones who were most likely to early vote. But in terms of like the places where we're seeing these record numbers, you don't see a connection there between that record turnout and which side could be benefiting from that.
That's right, because we do know that the vast majority of people who've cast their ballots so far are high-propensity voters. They voted in the last 2 presidential cycles. And that means that this is cannibalism of other methods of voting, a word that my editor told me I was not allowed to use in print.
I was going to say cannibalism.
No, really?
Voter cannibalism not allowed in my stories. So I think
But I guess it is allowed in the podcast.
I think we settled on displacement. Anyway,
Boo.
So Republicans are voting in enormous numbers. Republicans are voting in greater numbers in Nevada, for instance, in the early vote, and that's a crucial swing state. And it may very well mean that Trump has the advantage right now in Nevada, but we don't know because we don't know how much of that early vote is going to replace what would have come on Election Day. And there is an argument out there that the well is running dry for Republicans because they've done such a good job of telling their voters to get out and vote early, in person early. And, there are some predictions that in-person Election Day voting in a place like Nevada, for instance, will be as low as like 10 or 15% of the total vote cast, which is amazing. So we just don't know. And I'm not saying Trump doesn't win because he did this thing. He may. We just don't know.
Yeah, and I was really struck by our colleagues Philip Bump and Lenny Bronner, who ran the numbers on this, and they found that across the 7 swing states, of the people who voted early, 94% of both parties, people from both parties, whether party registration or whether you can deduce that they are a supporter of one of the other parties, 94% of both sides were voters that had voted in at least one of the last 4 elections. So, you throw in, there's a lot of young people out there who couldn't vote before, and you're talking about a lot of people who have a demonstrated voting history who are among these early voters. And so that makes it just so difficult to know. It is a good sign for Trump that Republicans are apparently turning out and they're banking these votes for the reasons that Amy talked about, because you don't want to leave it to Election Day when things can come up, but it is not a dispositive thing where you can just say, oh, Republicans are doing X amount better with the early vote than before, so that means they should win by this amount.
Right. And Democrats are still killing it on the mail-in ballots, and those ballots will continue to trickle in all the way to Election Day, and in some states past Election Day if they're postmarked by Election Day. So that's the sort of red mirage that we talk about sometimes, where it looks like Trump is ahead or the Republican is ahead, in a place like Pennsylvania in particular, where they can't even start processing those mail ballots until Election Day. But then the mail vote number continues to tick up for, in this case, Harris.
And I do want to ask briefly about North Carolina specifically, because we had so many conversations a few weeks back about the fallout from Hurricane Helene. Would that affect turnout? Like, what does it mean for this state that is now like potentially flippable for Democrats? And what have we seen there in the turnout so far? And like, what does that tell us about whether this like fear that the hurricane would depress the vote there, whether that was a real fear?
It hasn't happened. Turnout has been incredible in the western counties that were declared disaster areas.
Wow.
And a lot of that has to do with the messaging that went out from election officials, from state and local election officials, and from some emergency actions that they took to make it easier to vote, and that the state legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, codified by passing into law so that there wouldn't be some of those same arguments that happened back during the pandemic election, like, oh, the election officials illegally changed rules and favored the Democrats. They were okay with changing the rules when they perceived that it was going to favor Republicans. I'll say that. That's kind of an interesting flip on that issue. But the bottom line is that turnout has been incredible. Voters were given permission to turn their ballots in anywhere in the state, any election office. So, like, there's this huge diaspora, right? Like, Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is at risk of becoming a ghost town. I saw that headline this morning because so many people have left, and they're staying with their grown children in Raleigh or Charlotte. But Helene happened so many weeks ago that there was time for people to request a new ballot get mailed to wherever they were staying temporarily. And then they could either mail it back to their local election office or they could drop it at any election office in the state and it would be taken back to their local county. And that was a huge benefit.
But I do want to ask about a couple other voting issues that have come up, Amy. In particular, ballot boxes being set on fire? What is happening with that? Where have we seen ballots being burned, and how much should we be worried about this?
Okay, so we've seen ballots being burned, and we've seen fake images of ballots being burned.
That confuses things.
Yeah, there was a deep fake, and it was in suburban Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, where a video was circulated on social media showing a bunch of ballots being burned, and it wasn't actually accurate. And I think CISA, the federal cybersecurity agency, came out and said this is fake, and it came from Russia. But ballots were actually burned or damaged in Washington State and Oregon. And I actually was on the phone with some officials from those two states. I think it was yesterday. Time is kind of a circle right now. But who told me so much interesting things about ballot boxes. They use these ballot boxes because those are both vote by mail states, right? Universal, everybody gets a ballot. The vast majority of voters vote by mail. They use these ballot boxes that they actually requisitioned in Oregon because they needed these incredibly secure ballot boxes that are 1/2-inch thick metal. And there's two models. One weighs 600 pounds and one weighs 1,000 pounds. They're either bolted or cemented to the ground. They tested them with a dump truck to see if it could be moved, and it couldn't. And
I would have loved to watch that test happen.
I know, me too.
Someone just speeding a dump truck at a ballot box.
I know, me too. And the newer ones have anti-incendiary devices inside them so that if a bad actor comes around, as did happen in these two places, and puts an incendiary device through the slot, there's counterterrorism inside there that puts it out. The other thing is that they're designed.
Wow.
I know.
It's so high tech.
I know. The other thing that I learned is that they are designed to not have oxygen inside of them. Like, obviously, oxygen gets in when you open the slot, but somehow it closes really fast and it's sealed. And that's also part of the anti-incendiary technology, is to deprive any would-be fire from oxygen that it needs to grow. So
Wait, so did any ballots actually get burned or damaged?
Yes. But in one case, it was 3, and they were still able to identify the voters and contact them and give them an opportunity to vote again. In the other case, it was close to 500 ballots, which is obviously a lot, but they are also going through those ballots and trying to identify the voters and contact them. So it's kind of amazing, actually, that they were able to kind of swoop in and kind of, remediate the situation pretty quickly.
Aaron, do you have thoughts on why this is happening?
I mean, we don't know what the motivation is here. There's reporting that the incendiary devices in one of these cases had the words "Free Gaza" on them. That doesn't necessarily mean that this person is a supporter of the Palestinian cause. Sometimes people do things like that as a head fake. I think it's worth noting that before this happened, mere days before this happened, there was a report from Wired Magazine about the Department of Homeland Security basically warning about this exact thing, about ballot boxes being targeted. I think their reasoning was that this could be election deniers who are trying to, sow chaos and target these ballot boxes, which have been the subject of so many conspiracy theories about voter fraud. And the other thing I think is important here is that, it seems like a limited number of ballots were actually impacted, and a lot of these people whose ballots were damaged have had the opportunity to actually vote and have their votes counted. But think about the message that this sends to other people who would use those ballot drop boxes. Are you going to trust that you're going to put your ballot in that drop box, thinking that it could be targeted like this? That has an impact not just on faith in our elections, but also in people's voting habits. And so I think it's a pretty kind of scary moment in our politics that this has happened.
I agree with that, but I want to make one additional point and say that the turnout and the use of the drop boxes around the country where they are used, because they're not legal in all states, has been so robust that one of the things that these election officials said from those 2 Pacific Northwest states, as well as others around the country, is that they believe that the turnout and the activity that they're seeing and the resiliency of the people of Western North Carolina and so on is a sign that people do trust our elections. And that's like an actual pillar of election security, is public faith in the election, right? Like that's actually its own important thing. And so I completely agree with Aaron that there is an enormous effort underway by predominantly Trump allies to undermine our faith, and also not just Trump allies, but our foreign adversaries.
Foreign actors, yes.
Russia, Iran, and China. But it's not working, is the takeaway of election officials, which I think is an important point to make.
Yeah, and a very hopeful point.
Yay, American democracy.
All right, so let's take a break there, and then when we come back, we will talk about final thoughts going into the election, the latest look at the polling, and what's on your mind in these last few days. We'll be right back. So, Aaron, throughout this year, you have calmly guided us through poll after poll, moment after moment of the numbers going up and down and getting closer and closer. Where does the race stand right now?
Well, this morning I looked at our helpful Washington Post polling averages, which is a distillation of the most high-quality surveys, and it tends to be a little bit more selective about the ones that we use. We don't use kind of these fringe pollsters with methodologies that aren't terribly tested. And the short of it is that there's not been a whole lot of shifting. I mean, that's been the case for a long time, and it's still the case now. I think if you look really closely and you kind of squint at the numbers, you might see that Trump has gained a little bit in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. You might see that Harris has gained a little bit in Wisconsin and Michigan. But these are all shifts that are less than a point. And all of these states are now separated in our polling averages by 2 points or less. So,
which is within the margin of error, is that right? I'm getting the parlance now.
You don't even need a full margin of error shift in order to shift this race completely in one direction or another. You need to basically shift it half the margin of error, because the margin of error is usually about 4 points. So I think the best way that I have seen this distilled is from a user on X named John Gans. And his quote was this. He said, "So the forecasts say it's 50-50 and could be a blowout either way. This is not information. This is identical to not knowing anything." Which, I mean, like, that is such a distillation of where we're at right now. Like, 2 points shifted one way and Trump wins all 7 swing states. 2 points shifted the other way and Harris wins all 7 swing states. It is just so entirely close. And I know people are tired of hearing that, but it is so close in all of these states, and we have no real separation in any of them. So we don't know.
I know you guys are looking at the polls right now because it's your job, but for regular people who are like also sitting in this moment of anxiety and uncertainty, like, do you think that there is anything useful at this point and in the next 4 days to be looking at this stuff? Or is this just a moment where you sort of have to accept, as you say, that we actually don't have much information at all and we just don't know what's going to happen?
I mean, it's like all polling. If you are looking at it to predict something, you are likely going to be disappointed. If you're looking at it to give you some information about where things stand, then it can be helpful. We can look within these data and we see things like, Harris is running closer now to Trump when it comes to who people trust more on the economy. That's a significant data point because this was a significant advantage for Trump earlier in this campaign. You can look at things like the early vote, like the self-reported early vote. We have these early vote data where we see the party registration of who's coming out to vote early, and it's better for Republicans than it was before. There are more Republicans turning out than there were before, but we don't know who these people are voting for. Well, the polls give us some information on that. They actually show that Harris has a pretty substantial lead among the people who say they've already voted, and there are all kinds of caveats that come with that. But it gives us at least some information. And so I think the final days of this campaign are a time to look not at those top line numbers, which are not going to shift outside of the margin of error if they shift at all. It's at looking at some of these kind of smaller indicators that can give us a better sense of how those unaffiliated voters might shift, how much of a lead Harris is going to have going into Election Day, how some of these issues like the economy, like transgender rights are actually playing in the election. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm focused on right now.
Well, let me just ask, too, about down ballot races. I know that there are a lot of them, and we can't get to all of them, but just thinking about control of the House, control of the Senate, and some of these critical House and Senate races, how are those looking, and what should people expect from what they're going to be seeing come out on that on Tuesday and the days after?
Yeah, I think on the Senate front, it's pretty evident that Republicans are favored to take it over. That's just a symptom of a very favorable map for them. They already are going to win a seat in West Virginia. They're going to flip Joe Manchin's seat. He's retiring. And that gets them to 50-50. And then from there, it's, if they win the White House, they have the tiebreaker and they already have the majority. Otherwise, they need to win just one other seat, and they have all these red states and swing states where they are playing offense. Democrats are not really playing offense anywhere. There is an interesting race in Nebraska where independent Dan Osborne is running against Republican Senator Deb Fischer. There is no Democrat on the ballot. That appears to be a real race, and independent Dan Osborne could win, but that seems to be something that wouldn't actually impact the majority math, according to what we know right now. So more interesting than anything else. In the House, there was a forecast I saw this morning from the Cook Political Report, who is kind of my go-to for understanding the House, put the gap, the potential outcomes of the election at between a Republican gain of 5 seats and between a Democratic gain of 10 seats. Well, Democrats need to gain 4 seats in order to win the majority. So basically, you're having the outcomes span the number of seats Democrats need to flip the House. So that looks like it's going to be a very close race. We don't have a whole lot of polling on these House races, but you tend to think that these races kind of mirror the national environment. And to the extent we have a very close presidential race, we should expect the race for the House to be close as well.
Interesting. Wait, so if I could summarize what you're saying, it's that the Senate looks really, really tough for Democrats, but the House is basically the same place where the presidential race is at, where it's like, who can say?
Yes, I think the Senate is the race that we think we have the best understanding of, and we can say who is likely to win it. Everything else is pretty much a toss-up at this point.
All right, so I want to ask one last question before we wrap up here today. Just thinking about this as a moment of reflection in these final days before this whole thing is over. What has it been like for both of you to cover this election?
I usually don't wish for these things to be over. Like, I write about campaigns, all the time.
Yeah, like this is your time
even
to
when
shine.
when it's 15 months away, I've got an eye on the campaign. So it's often like a little bit sad for me that like it's coming to an end and like I don't get to write about a campaign anymore. I guess the good news is that it probably won't actually be over on Tuesday or even next week. Like
I don't think that's
still
good
be
news.
Talking about these things for weeks and weeks on end. So enjoy that, America.
There were 2 weeks in the month of October where in each week I flew 7 times to various places, and I'm too old for that. I was so tired. I just can't do it anymore. So
Racking up those miles, though.
I am so racking up the miles. I'm about to be 1K, baby, on United Airlines.
Gold, platinum, whatever it is.
Amy needs a beach. We're going to put Amy on a beach with those miles.
All right. Well, on that note, let's wrap it up. Thank you both so much for chatting today.
Super fun. Thanks.
Thank you.
Amy Gardner covers voting for The Post.
And before we go, make sure that you are subscribing to the Campaign Moment newsletter. We are going to be watching things all election week, of course. We'll be having a preview on Monday. We'll be wrapping things on Wednesday. So keep an eye on your inbox for the Campaign Moment newsletter.
Aaron has told me about his intended sleep schedule for election week, or at least election night, and not going to sleep until, 4, 5, 6 a.m.? That's how committed he is.
This is a real dilemma, because I think last time I just powered through all night and stayed up until 2 o'clock the next afternoon. And I don't know,
Oh my gosh.
I'm over 40 now. I don't know if I can handle that this time.
That's too much. That's
We'll
too
see.
much. So for folks who want to or have not yet subscribed to the Campaign Moment newsletter, we have a link in our show notes and at postreports.com on how to do that, because clearly you do not want to be missing anything that Aaron is writing next week. Also, if you're listening to this episode on Post Reports, make sure that you're subscribed to the Campaign Moment podcast. We're going to be publishing a steady stream of extra episodes next week, dispatches after Election Day. As we say, we don't know how long this is going to last until a winner is called. And so you're going to hear a lot on the Campaign Moment. Make sure that you are following the Campaign Moment on your podcast app.
Today's episode was produced by Eliza Dennis and mixed by Sam Baer. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Spernovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Elahe Azadi. I'm Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Aaron, I will see you next week for Election Day.
Let's do it.
Woo!